Hello. So this is Mr. McCormick. We're at Negri-Nepote Grasslands, which is a restored grasslands. Hopefully you can hear me. It's windy out today and it's a beautiful spring day. So I'm putting my hat on. It's freezing cold. But this has a power line right of way and it's being maintained as a grassland. And that's part of what we try to do with restoration ecology is we try to get habitats that are no longer in large supply and maintain them and conserve and actually to preserve them. This is not really a conservation effort but more of a preservation effort since we're trying to maintain the same form over length of time. And there is a land use to it. We are using it. There are trails, but that's not the main purpose. So this is a heavily fragmented landscape though, because if you realize that all of that grassland that's actually behind me on this side, we have housing. We have a residential area, we have, and if it was to be what normally is around here, it would be temperate deciduous forest. It would not be a smooth path like it is here. We have now a pathway, we have a grassland that we're manicured and that we're making sure that well, it's not really manicured, but we're making sure that it serves the purpose that we want it to serve, to conserve grassland. And on this side though, we have an abrupt end. This is not a normal end from a forest going out into a field. This is edge habitat still, however. Although it would be a more subtle transition into the grassland naturally, this is what we normally find around here, habitat fragments. But you do have species that depend upon this type of area, and edge habitat itself is important. So here, this is actually multifloral rose, which leaves are out. You realize I did say it's springtime, and it's actually been springtime for some species for quite some time. Now, some species so they're not really in springtime mode. And some species have been for quite some time. The way we talk about spring is on astronomy and the movement of the Earth around the sun. But that's not necessarily how every species sees springtime. So there is, besides this edge habitat and the importance of this edge habitat, there is importance in looking at how different parts of nature see different seasons. And we can call this phenology. This is my crop printing, that's it. So we can call this phenology, which is the study of seasonal occurrences and how they occur. And we'll get back to this later. But as you can see, this is edge habitat, very abrupt at this point, and we'll see what species exist in there. There are birds that depend upon it. There are plants that depend upon it, and I'm sure there are many other types of organisms that do too. So we'll start walking down at this time. This is not a typical plant that lives in the edge. This seems to have also been cut a bit. And this is American holly. And it's an evergreen. And evergreen just means it doesn't lose its leaves. Actually, it's also a single gender. It is either male or female. It's not so the reproduction can be both around. I'm not entirely sure why it's in this area, except again, this is a very unnatural edge. The maintenance that goes into a place like this to keep it a grassland, including on the edges, they either mow, and typically they do mow here, and I know they do, but they also have prescribed burns. So they will burn off some of this land, some of this grass, because what you're really looking at in a community like this is you're looking at ecological succession. And ecological succession is the change in the community over time. And a community is the assemblage of plants and animals and all the species that are there, all the living things that are there. So they do change over time. But some species cannot compete as well with others. So if you see grass needs open light. They can grow on grasses can grow on poor soils. They don't need good soil quality. They don't need a lot of nitrogen in the soil like trees do, like deciduous trees do. So what they do is they get somewhere quickly, to disperse quickly to an area, like an old field or whatever it might be that was abandoned at one point in time, and then they grow quickly. But eventually, there may be a large acorn or something that you get somehow out into that middle of the field. You do wind up with some trees growing, and these trees, they outcompete the grasses. They get taller than the grasses. They take up sunlight, and sunlight's important for plants. So as they take up that sunlight, they wind up outcompeting the grass and killing the grass below them. So this is the idea of ecological succession, that this community and this ecosystem really is going to change in form over time. And eventually in this area, it probably will become a temperate deciduous forest. That's the biome type that we have. But succession never ends. It's dynamic. It keeps going. So there's no end point to it. So it could always change back to something else, or could change to something completely different. So here are deer tracks. And this is an area that has a lot of deer. So 2 days ago when I came here to just check out and see how the area was. But it is maintained partly for, like I said, we do have human uses for this land. So it's an area where you can actually go bow hunting or during the winter time. So it shouldn't surprise you to see deer tracks, or even at times to hear people shooting rifles, which is not something that I really want to hear today or ever, but that's a different story. We're gonna go right up this hill for a little bit more. I mean, there's some birds that are in the area, but we're not really gonna be able to see them on this wonderful recording that I'm making, because I don't have those skills. As you can see, we have some pines that are actually starting to grow into these conifers are growing into the grassland. This is what we're trying to prevent, basically, at this point. And they will. They'll mow this. From what I understand from talking to the one person who lives on this land, there's actually a house behind us over there in that direction, that they really didn't mow it last year, which was surprising. They usually do it every year. But they will. They'll mow it, or they'll burn this section. And they'll be able to get rid of these pine trees, because the types of species we're trying to protect in this area, like the grasshopper sparrow and eastern meadowlark and some other some butterflies, are really grassland species, and that's the habitat type that's in short supply. Now, pines can do fairly well growing out into places where the soil isn't that great, as opposed to deciduous trees. But really, these guys are coming from over there. So if you take a look, we have an abrupt boundary again with another house behind it. Is a residential area, and it's not a natural area in any way, shape, or form. You wouldn't see huge trees and then such a steep drop off in height to the vegetative structure below. So this is another example of how the edge is different in areas that have been heavily fragmented. So over here we have a blind that was actually built for this vernal pool, which is behind us. And vernal means seasonal. It means that it can disappear, and it does at times. It's not fed by groundwater. So what the Boy Scouts did that built this is they just dug a hole. And this is called hydrology. Water flows downhill. So it collects at the lowest points in a landscape. And one reason that you do something like this is set up a wetland. This is a type of wetland. Any area that has water on it for a sizable time during the year, a significant time during the year, is going to be considered a wetland, especially if it has the right vegetation and type of soil, which we call hydric soil. And we'll show you another wetland, most likely in the forest back there. But this is what you would see out in the prairies. Would be called a prairie pothole. It'd be caused by maybe by glaciers or something like that. But this is something that we have constructed. And one reason we do this is to add to the biodiversity of the area. Biodiversity is just the variety of life. It really is just that. So you have more different kinds of living things. You have more different kinds of genes. You have more different habitat types. You have more different kinds of species. More different is not what I mean to say, but different kinds of species. And this gives them a chance to live in this area as well. And this is a freshwater wetlands, which is in the type of wetlands around here that we don't have that many of. We have many more saltwater wetlands. So as you come up here, we can see species that live in this wetlands. At least you can see some of the plants that do. I'm not sure if you can hear on the video, there are red-winged blackbirds that are calling in the background, and they live in areas like this too, and they're quite common. They're not something that we would build a whole park to try to preserve. But you can see the reeds in the front, and they actually get to be a problem. So some of the reeds that look like that are what we call Phragmites. And Phragmites can be either native or an invasive species. These reeds appear to be native actually, and they're smaller and they don't take over the area as much as the invasive species that came from Australia. So Phragmites you would see at even along the side of roadways, any spot where it really gets to be pretty wet, and they can take hold, they're clonal. So what they do is they send out root shoots, and this becomes another part of them, and another stem, and another plant, really. And because of that, they can grow very quickly. They also can disperse seeds in the wind. And wind-dispersed seeds can go far and wide, and they go pretty quickly as well. So with those two means of dispersal, and by also being clonal and being able to support their offspring directly through that root shoot, they have caused problems for being able to outcompete our native species that live in the area. So as you can see behind me, we do have a few more shrubs. We do have red cedar, for example, which is actually, the bark is really good for starting fires, for kindling. We do have some cherry trees as well. I'm not really sure why the cherry trees, but they can survive in an area like this as well. And this brings me back to the idea of ecological succession. That if we were to start with no life, which is not what has happened here at all, if you were to start with no life at all, we call that primary succession, where after a lava flow, all the seeds are burned up and everything. That would be primary succession. But here we're really talking about secondary succession is what has taken place here over time. You go from an old farmer's field, for example, and then if you were to let it grow up over time, this is what you'd see more and more of, especially as you're closer to the forest. And part of that is because of seed dispersal, and that's something that you should plan out if you were trying to have this place grow back into a forest, which we here are trying to actually prevent. But this is a good example again of secondary succession, where eventually as these plants start to die, because everything dies, they will add more organic material to the soil, more humus to the soil, more nitrogen to the soil, and that will let things like trees and deciduous trees really start to grow more. And then below that, they'll kill off more and more of the grass because there's less and less light. So over time, light at the ground level will decrease in succession if we're going towards a forest. Soil quality will increase. The vegetative structure, the three-dimensional structure of the vegetation, that will increase over time. And biodiversity often will also increase. Although, just thinking about this as one type of landscape, one homogeneous landscape with just one species of grass would be wrong. There's different species of grasses that do exist here. And, you know, grasses are flat. This is what a grass actually is. You take a look, the leaves themselves are flat blades of grass. We also have ones that are round, those are reeds, and ones that are square. The stems are actually square in shape, and you can feel that, and those are called cords. But here, most of it is grass. There are a couple of reeds as well. So this is a power line right of way, really. A lot of grassland that we have in New Jersey is dependent upon these right-of-ways. That's why they're maintained. You really don't want a tree knocking out a power line. That would be bad, right? So there's a trade-off, if you really think about it, with some of the human influences that we have on nature. One, if we didn't have some of the power line right-of-ways, we wouldn't have some of the grassland that we have. It's patchy as it is, and it's really patchy. So the maintenance of some of the grasslands we have and the existence of some of the species we have depends upon some influences that are not so great for the environment. Power lines are not good for the environment, but they do have effects that can help certain species out at times. For example, raptors will use these as hunting perches as well. So if you take a look at power lines overall, they do have a negative effect. However, there are some positive effects that would need to be, if we didn't have the power line right-of-ways and we didn't maintain them, there would need to be something else that would come into play that would help protect the species that we're dealing with here, much like this grassland. At this point, this power line right-of-way is not the only reason that this is maintained as a grassland. We're intentionally doing so, but that's not always the case. For example, there are many spots that golden wing warblers, which are extremely rare in New Jersey and overall declining, depend upon certain grasslands in places that are not really there. So one of the best nesting places that I know in New Jersey is a power line right-of-way that is not being maintained for that species at all. It's for the power, for the people. And we do understand that's important too. So oftentimes human influences are very difficult to assay and figure out from a cost-benefit analysis sometimes what they really do. Ecology is really interconnected. If we're dealing with ecosystems, they're really interconnected. And there are many variables, some of which we don't truly understand. We do understand that this is my phenology paper from before, that I shouldn't throw this in the ground. But one of the things that, as we look at this, what are the real influences of this piece of paper? Doesn't have anything to do with global climate change, which we always love to mention, which is a huge problem and needs to be addressed. Well, that's complicated. And it does, but let's think about all of them. Trees taking carbon dioxide. You cut down trees to make paper. So obviously that is a concern. However, it's really the young trees that grow an awful lot, have a high rate of growth, a high rate of photosynthesis, that take in more carbon dioxide. And that's a concern as well. But how much does this really impact? This is one piece of paper from a carbon footprint standpoint. There are people who do this research. You'd have to look into the paper making process, how much fuel is used, how much of that is fossil fuels versus renewable energy. And actually, there's an awful lot. If I leave it here to decompose into the ground, the carbon can go back into the ground. And also, still not good for the environment, though. We're dealing with solid waste. Realize that not all pollution, the main impact of all pollution is not global climate change, although a lot of it can be connected to it, and it is a good thing to always be aware of. Pollution, solid waste pollution in and of itself, and not reusing materials that we have, and whatever chemicals might be going to this paper, I actually have no idea. That's important. It's important to pay attention to pollution of all types, not just global climate change, but also global climate change as part of it. The release of fossil fuels is what really, like carbon dioxide from cars, that's a really important pollution source that we need to minimize in order to have a more sustainable planet.
Talk.
So that's a raccoon track in front of you. They like wetlands, and that's actually kind of where we're going now. We're going into a forested area with a wetland, which is going to be a swamp. So we're now in a forest that is abutting the grassland right behind me, and you can probably still see the grassland behind me as well. And there's a stream that cuts through, and there's a swampy area back there, and a swamp really is a wetland that has trees and some kind of standing water. We could talk about, this is lotic water as it flows, and lentic water is more standing. But a couple of things that are really different in a forested area, and this is a temperate deciduous forest again, than the grassland. And one is soil quality. And one reason for the difference in soil quality is the trees themselves. If you see here, we have some leaf litter, and we also have some bark and sticks and stuff, but you see some leaf litter, and this decomposes. This is going to be a whole detritus-based community here where we have a number of insects and other organisms that live off of it and in it, and use it for refugia, use it for a place to survive and hide, but also things to eat. I mean, there are things that eat these as well, including earthworms. So we have all of this organic matter going into the top layer of soil, the humus in the soil, and you have bedrock that will decompose, that will break apart, weather, not decompose, that will weather from the bottom and add minerals as it goes up through the layers of the soil. And this is how we add more quality to the soil that plants really need. If you also take a look on, we have a lot of different relationships between organisms that exist. And here is an example of a symbiotic relationship. This is a lichen. So we have lichens on the trees, we have actually moss here, and we have fungi here. Very different organisms all taken together. Lichens are a combination of two completely different organisms. We were dealing with a fungus and an algae, and together they have joined together into having kind of one life. That's what symbiosis means, that they now share the same life, where one provides protection and the other provides food in this case. And the moss is just a plant. It's a non-vascular plant. It does not have a vascular system like you and I. We have a circulatory system with veins and arteries. Plants have the same kind of structure too, with xylem and phloem, which we have vessels for bulk transport. That's what they have. So do we. We have bulk transport through our arteries and veins. Moss really doesn't have that, and what they do instead is they spread out, and because of that, they can use simpler means for transport. And again, so different organisms on this dead tree, and dead trees are important too. So they provide nutrients and resources and places for things to live on. In Europe, at one point, they were taking down a lot of the old dead trees because they thought they were ugly and they needed them for fuel and all that. And what that caused is problems for organisms like woodpeckers. So they had a problem with maintaining woodpecker populations over time. But we're going to move on at this point. So this is a really small ecosystem in and of itself. This is what we call pit and mound ecology, where we have a large tree that's fallen over, and you can see the trees right there. Actually, those are the roots that have come up, and there's a pit that's left behind. And you have two very different microclimates that you're dealing with here. One that's really moist, and in this case actually is filled in because of hydrology, but there's also more shade in the pit part of the pit and mound. And the mound gets a lot drier, so you do have species that actually will jump from these areas from one pit and mound to another pit and mound, or pit or mound really, because they live on one or the other. And so you get a different assemblage of plants. You also, in this particular, during the spring, in this particular spot, I have seen leopard frogs that use these little ponds. So they are important, and more important than you might think. And this is another example of the variety and biodiversity that can exist in very small areas within a larger landscape. So here we do have, and we're on the trail, but here we do have a couple of things. We have some peat moss here, and this actually, over a long period of time, if you peat moss can become a fuel, and it is oftentimes there are peat bogs as well, where there's not much oxygen, so decomposition is slowed as well. We also have walnut shells, and it looks like somebody has enjoyed themselves eating some walnuts back here. And by somebody, I mean most likely a squirrel. Could be something else as well. Can't really tell. Don't really see any markings on there that are going to really give it away for me anyway. Maybe someone else could be able to do that. I would think it's a squirrel. Oh, so this is milkweed, and if you've never heard of milkweed, it has these pods on top, and as you can clearly see, there's a white liquid that comes out. No, of course not. This is dry and dead. But if this was to be a live plant at this point, not really senescent, it's most likely senescent, meaning it's in a state of sleep at this time, or maybe it is dead, not entirely sure. But there is a white toxic fluid that flows throughout this. This is the host plant for monarchs, for monarch butterflies. And they do use it so that they can become toxic as adults, and then the birds will leave them alone. We've reached the end of our journey today. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.